Do atheists ever deconstruct from their worldview and end up in Christianity? Well, that's what we're going to talk about with my special guest, Jana Harmon, on this episode as we deal with deconstruction. We talk about all sorts of great topics on common themes that we see from people as they go from atheists to Christians. And this is backed by Jana's research that she's done. And it's also backed by several stories that she has on her Side B podcast. Well, Jana, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you today, Tim.
Well, I'm really excited. I did an episode a couple weeks ago with one of my guests. His name is Joel, and he talked about people kind of deconverting Christians that would slowly over time deconvert. He talked about what the, kind of factors with those were. And somebody mentioned when I put that video out, you really should talk about when atheists convert to Christianity. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, because you have a podcast called the Side B podcast, where you're talking to people that have gone from atheist to Christianity. So, tell me a little bit about that podcast and how you got into having those conversations with people that go from atheist to Christianity.
Yeah, it's a great podcast because everyone loves stories and everybody's intrigued with this sense of transformation and how someone can move from such an extreme perspective against God to belief, and not just belief or an affiliation. We're talking full blown, full in kind of Christianity. And that is a huge character arc, and so it's just an intriguing question. It's almost like $1 million question. How in the world would something like that happen? Well, these stories are wonderful, and they are on the podcast, and each episode is a different story. But I got into these stories really very intrigued. First, I think having had education in Christian apologetics and came out of that graduate degree and saw all of what I thought were very convincing arguments for the existence of God. And it was hard for me at that point, after having seen what I thought was a very solid and compelling cumulative case for the Christian worldview, how if someone wasn't presented with the evidence or the arguments, why couldn't they believe? Because I would see debates and read books and these exchange of ideas between atheists and Christians, and it just seemed like two ships passing in the night.
Yeah, there
didn't seem to be a lot of give or take on either side. It's like, okay, that's their side, that's the atheist side. Okay, that's the Christian side. Okay, I guess we know it, and nobody seems to be making any difference. So I thought, well, what would it take for an atheist to become a Christian? Is it just intellectual? Well, it doesn't seem to be so, because it seems like there has to be something more than that going on. And of course, we're human beings. We're very complex. And at the time, I was trying to, really think about this question and pursue it. And I was reading people like Blaise Pascal, who really appreciated not only the reason, but the passion in each of us, and how passion can inform reason, and reason can inform passion anyway. And I was also reading Francis Schaeffer, and I'm working with the C.S. Lewis Institute and reading, all about the abolition of man, and our will and our emotion and our virtue, and all of these things, that we are just complex as individuals. And so it opened that door for me to want to know about, well, how do we form beliefs? And what does it take to change beliefs? And again, so I went back to that question, pursuing this in my research at a PhD level, and that is, how do we form beliefs, particularly in the religious conversion environment? How do we form beliefs? How do we change beliefs, particularly towards religion? So that's how it all started. And I honed that question between these two populations because, that's what had been in my world, looking and juxtaposing the naturalistic atheistic worldview with the Christian worldview. So at the end of the day, that's what I did.
Well, again,
I
this is fascinating for me. I'm so excited. So I do. We're going to get to some of these bigger questions. Maybe are there some common themes? But I would love for you to share. Maybe if there's a few guests that really stood out on your program, and maybe why those guests stood out to you as you kind of think back over a number of the episodes that you've done now.
Wow, that's a great question, Tim. And it's a hard one to answer because I think every story every story
Right.
is a standout. Every story is fascinating because every person is fascinating. And
Yes.
just like, in your deconversion stories, everybody has their story. Everybody has their reasons. Everybody has their background story.
Yeah.
And then what seems to pull their faith apart, what that
Mm.
journey is. I think you and Joel talked about setting conditions, and triggers and, all of these things that we have our sense of reality, our worldview and the way we see the world, and then something changes in us, that we're willing to go a different direction.
Mm.
Um, these these stories, I think probably the first person I sat down, I did my PhD in England,
Okay.
and I interviewed over 50 former atheists. And so one of the first ones that I interviewed, I think, is probably one of the most memorable. His name is Mike Arnold. In fact, he's the first episode on my series of Side B episodes. But it was in England, and I met him next to a train station, a little coffee shop, and we sat down over a cup of tea. And each person who participated in my study had done a survey, and they answered all these questions about, you know, their journey, basically their perceptions as atheists and whatnot.
Right.
And in that survey, he said that he had become an atheist at age 7. Well, I
Okay.
thought that's pretty young, to be making such a strong declaration of disbelief,
Hmm.
and something must have happened. So that's basically how I started our conversation. I'm like, well, 7 years old.
Yeah.
What happened? What changed? And for him, he in the next 30 seconds, he pretty well summed it up, that he had gone to church as a child, believed that Jesus loved him. And then one day, a five of two of his brothers. And when that happened, he said, I no longer could believe in God.
Mm.
And then he went on in his life with a very virulent hatred against God and all things religious, wouldn't even step foot inside of a church for a wedding or a funeral. And he said at great social cost, and he had a lot of anger in his life. But he wrapped all of this pain and anger in some pretty sophisticated rational arguments against God. And so he
Mm.
became an evangelist for atheism, a strong anti-theist.
Okay.
So you look at that kind of thing, and he was 26 when something interrupted his life.
Mm.
That caused a change. So I don't I don't know if you want me to.
No,
That's a big tease.
yeah, yeah. So I want people to go check out that episode because I think that's
Yeah,
a really good one. It's a good one. So
yeah. So that that something like that is more an emotionally based atheism, and so you look at what might cause or might breach that kind of anger. But then there are other stories, like someone who in Britain, again, a lot of people I interviewed in Britain, or perhaps in the Northwest United States or Canada, France, Australia, New Zealand, a lot of these cultures, people grow up where religion is just not on the radar. It's just a real lack of exposure. They have very little interaction or engagement with anything that really is authentic Christianity, embodied Christianity, Christians at all. And so their understanding of Christianity would be a very culturally informed, typically very negative view, stereotypes of Christianity. And so it's not anything they want to have anything to do with. It's just not necessary. It's irrelevant. It's unattractive. All of these negative things. So, like, for example, the most recent drop we had last Friday is Michael Bird. He's from
yep.
Australia. He said, you know, I perceived Christianity as Ned Flanders. I mean, that
Right.
was his reference. That was
Yeah.
his only reference. Other than, in our interview, we talked um, about some more television references or movies. Typically the priest who's not so good, or she's oftentimes characterized in the arts as the evil person.
Right.
The perpetrator.
Yeah.
Wolf in sheep's clothing, and so there was nothing attractive about Christianity to him. He wanted nothing to do with it. He didn't need it in his life. So again, that kind of conversion story may be very different because when someone has a very strong lack of exposure, which many people do, and it's increasingly so, and then they get a marginalized view of Christianity, it may be that, again, a disruption, a breach in that negative stereotype, and then you encounter something very different than what you thought it was. There's that kind of story.
Yeah.
There are also very intellectually driven stories. Like, I think one of the most profound stories I heard of, atheists, demographically speaking, are highly educated.
Yeah.
They're intelligent people. Uh, oftentimes, sometimes they haven't looked, and oftentimes, in fact, we're all guilty of this, that we haven't really looked at or justified our worldview. We just presume it. But this guy was very brilliant, and he did think about what atheism was. He was extremely well informed. By the time he was 14, he had read all the French existentialists.
Yeah.
He had actually soberly adopted the nihilistic viewpoint, of what it meant to have a viewpoint that is atheist true and true. He was willing to look at the underbelly of what that meant in terms of meaning and purpose, and what it meant for his life and choices and all of those things. In fact, so much so that it actually it was depressing to him in some way, even though but he was too smart. He was too intelligent for Christianity. It just, intellectually was not on the radar, not just culturally, intellectually, it just wasn't an option. So what would it take for someone like that, to change such an entrenched view that sometimes people would actually look at the Christian story and say, that's a good thing. It's actually kind of beautiful. Jesus is an incredible person. I just can't believe it.
Right.
But for him, there was no taste for the superstition that Christianity and all religion was for him at that point. So to see his narrative and to see what took him from A to B was pretty amazing. Now, I don't know if you want me to complete that story. He's not on the podcast, so nobody can go look for it.
Oh, man.
I know, but
well, yeah, maybe try to wrap that into kind of this follow-up question of what are some of the trends or some of the commonalities? I mean, I know for me that I've had several friends that are, atheists, and we have really intense dialogues. But there was one person in particular where I felt like, as far as she would say, that I had, answered a good deal of her objections, but there was just something that was just continually resisted that, kind of full immersion into Christianity. And, when we would talk about things about the, the truthfulness of the scriptures, or the, Jesus resurrecting and the possibility of God existing, she would be like, yeah, I have no more objections, but she just couldn't get over that line. And I was like, man, so that sent me on this whole journey of looking into epistemology and how beliefs are formed. And I've looked at things, there's this thing called the influencer model, where there's certain things that influence what we do. And you can actually kind of manipulate some of that by your surroundings and by your environment and the people that are around you and the things that you're reading. And so I jumped into this giant foray into epistemology and all these other facets of it. So I love this conversation. So for you and your work, what are some of those common themes that seem to kind of push people over the edge?
That is so insightful, Tim. And I do appreciate you bringing this up because I think, again, as those of us who appreciate the argument and the evidence and all there is to that, we know in our own selves that we're not rational only creatures.
Right, right.
An example that I can give for you is that my husband actually played college ball at a D1 school.
Okay.
And he is, his life, his experience, his investment, his everything about it was all about Georgia football.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my daughter wanted to go to Auburn.
Okay.
And if I tried to convince him that that was a good idea based upon statistics and evidence, and even if they had the better football team, at that point, there are so many overriding emotional, social, experiential factors in his devotion to Georgia football. It didn't matter what the stats were or whatever, whether it's academics or football or whatever, wouldn't be his choice for her. Now, that was her choice, but that wouldn't be his choice. You can see how his view of that was wrapped up into who he was, where he came from, what he had experienced, how he felt, where his desires, his loves lie, right?
Yeah.
So when we look at worldview, it's so much more than what we think, right? And so so we need to take a holistic view of those things. So with the girl that you were speaking to, and back to your question about why people push away, well, there are a lot of different reasons for that. Let's say, for example, the guy that I was just talking about, the very intelligent guy. Well, of course he was bright, he was brainy, and but there were a lot of other things going on in his life.
Yeah.
He had a dad who was a brilliant scientist, atheist, right? They had Carl Sagan's Cosmos on the coffee table, not the Bible.
Right. Yeah.
So he had a model of that. He had a self-perception of he was captain of the debate team. He was the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah.
So there's an identity issue. Morally, he had a moral blank check, right? To do whatever he wanted to do, to follow his desires wherever they wanted to go. Now that, because his worldview allowed for him to do that. He had experiences, his friend group, all very antagonistic towards Christians. He was involved socioculturally with a friend group. So when you talk about just changing a worldview, it's not just changing your mind, it's changing your world, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's in some cases turning your world upside down. So when you look at, there has to be not only plausibility of belief, rationally, there has to be an attraction, right? It has to be seen as good or relevant or something that you would desire, because those things are all very important. It also has to be something that you think would be existentially satisfying, meet those needs, the way you want to live your life. And for many people, there's just too many objections. You may be sad. It's kind of like, I guess, what Frank Turek says. I always ask the question, well, if Christianity was true, would you believe it?
Yeah.
Well, why not? Let's pull back the curtain. Let's take a closer look at, what your objections are. So it's really wanting to hear someone's story and hear someone's objections. Let's move beyond the rational. Let's see what else is there. Where you may have met a Christian who, was really hypocritical, gave a very poor picture. You may have been hurt by a religious person at church. You may have been there's one guy, podcast, his father got sick. He said, I prayed for the first time in my life that God would save my dad, and he didn't. He went from there, he said, to have a war on God.
Yeah.
He became, again, one of those angry atheist, he said, I would, go to the bookstore and put the Bible in the fiction section. He had a lot of animus towards God and religion. So you have to look at all these different reasons why someone might push back, whether it's lack of exposure, negative exposure, you met a Christian, you hadn't met a Christian, the things you want, you desire, the things you don't want. If Christianity is something marginalized for those people, and again, you have to look in our culture and go, oh, those are those people. I don't want to have anything to do with those people.
Right.
That alone could be a reason to reject Christianity, depending on where and how someone values what's going on in their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's
So
really
lots
good.
of different reasons.
Yeah, man, I'm still struck by your initial analogy of your husband going to Georgia and your daughter wanting to go to Auburn. Because one of the things that I often think about, and I'm not necessarily equating like of a football or sports team to a worldview to something like Christianity, but I think even asking that question of like, why do you like Team X, right? Like, why are you a Cleveland Browns fan or a Steelers fan or whatever? And just let people like think about that for a second, because sometimes it goes back to like, well, my dad was, or because we grew up in Cleveland, or this is what everybody that was around me, there was this commonality that you had to be a whatever, you had to be a blank fan. And so when you start to like question some of those things and you say, okay, maybe I don't have to be. And as someone that's not a diehard sports fan at all, I'm kind of like, all right, I'll like the Panthers because I live in Charlotte now, or I'll like the Steelers because I lived in Pennsylvania for a while. And I don't really care that much, but I think there's other things that I do care a lot about. And when I start to really question or ask those questions, I think that really helps for me to understand why I have those beliefs. So I think one of my follow-ups to that would be, what are some of the things that need to kind of start being in place for people to start questioning their atheism, if you will? Like, what are some of those common threads that you've seen as you've dialogued with people that have gone on that journey?
That's a great question. When I was looking at the stories of all these 50 atheists, I was trying to look at their journey, what informed their atheism? What was what I called the catalyst?
Okay.
What was the catalyst that actually turned somebody either towards openness or pursuit, even to disprove, what was that thing that caused someone to take a closer look at God, or the question of God, or Christianity? And really let me just say, there are a couple different kind of big paradigms, and then I'll break that down into more specifics. But if you're an atheist and you have a certain view of the world, and you think that atheism is the best thing since sliced bread, it's going to, give you everything you need intellectually, the life that you want morally, existentially, it's going to give you the social and vocational, it's going to give you all these things. So, we all want a worldview that makes sense. We all want a world that's satisfying.
Right.
For some atheists, they have this maybe not pristine or perfect view of their world, or even have looked at their own presumptions, but for whatever reason, they think this is the life, and this is my belief, and I'm going to stick with it. In fact, 63% said they would never, ever change from atheism,
Wow.
Highly resistant, never believe anything else. But for some of them, as they live out and through their atheism, they find one of two things. One is that through experience, they have an expectation, then they have an experience, whether it be intellectually. Somehow it's not answering some of my questions. Like a few people in my study, the question of objective morality was really a difficult one to overcome, because it's extremely difficult to ground without a transcendent objective source.
Yeah.
So for those atheists who were really thoughtful, and they're really thinkers, and a lot of them are very contemplative, very, very intelligent, inquisitive, they deep thinkers, they had to move in such a way that they had to find the answer to that.
Mm.
There was one, another one intellectually that he was like, when you think about atheism and that it is a determined cause and effect, and that affected who I was, I really didn't have genuine free will.
Yeah.
I had to come to a point, he said, where I had to admit to myself that I am not thinking and I am not acting. I'm only
Wow.
reacting.
Yeah.
And he said that was a cognitive dissonance that he couldn't live with.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, or even existentially, there was one where you have your atheism, you think is again the greatest thing. Joined, Freedom from Religion Foundation, all of this kind of thing. Dan Barker was his hero. But over time, and he enjoyed what he called the intellectual superiority of atheism, and he lived that out. He said, he had a very, frankly hedonistic, pleasure-seeking lifestyle. It gave him everything. He did everything he wanted to do, but he said, over time, he said, I was getting older in my 30s, which for me, it's all relative. I don't know how old you are, but I'm much beyond that.
I just turned 40 a short time ago. So yeah, I'm with you.
I was getting into my 30s, feeling older, and I was looking at my life. And he said it felt as if, he said two things. One thing is that I could actually see my choices and my decisions and how really depraved they were, how I was hurting people, because not, and that's not to say atheists aren't good moral people.
Right.
I don't want to make that statement, because that's not true. Atheists can be some of the most moral people that you can meet.
Right.
But for him, in his own life story and his own life choices, he began to become very disheartened by looking at his own life. The other thing was, he said, I didn't enjoy the intellectual superiority of it anymore. And finally, he said, my life, the emptiness of it, the meaninglessness of it. He said it felt as if my life was building a sand castle and watching the waves come in and just tear it down. And he said, am I just going to do the same thing over and over again? It was just, he reached this point of existential longing that he said he was actually married to a Christian. He saw what Christian life could look like, particularly in his wife and in his extended family on her side. And he said they were kind and they were generous and they were lovely and they were very, easy people. They had a joy that he knew he didn't have. And he said, it made me willing to at least, he said, was I so prideful that I wouldn't consider, at least considering something else because my worldview wasn't working for me. So, so that is what I would call a catalyst that is a disruptive longing.
Okay.
Whether it's intellectually or existentially. There's other disruptive catalysts. One would be, say, an embodied witness. We talked about the fact that a lot of people have these caricatured ideas of religious people. There's a there's a study that I ran across in my research, written in 2014, of a guy who actually looked at the social distancing. Now, of course, this was well before COVID, right? Of atheists and agnostics, and the distance, that social distance they would create between themselves and religious people. And it turned out the greatest social distancing was between themselves and devout religious believers, particularly Mormons and evangelical Christians. So you can imagine that if you have a perspective of Christianity and you've really never engaged in it, which over half of the people that I engaged with had never had any close. So you have a picture in your mind, like a lot of Christians, unfortunately, have a picture in their mind of who atheists are, and it's totally wrong. Atheists are, like I was saying, intelligent, smart, generous people, amazing people. But you have this caricature in your mind of who you think they are. And then someone interrupts your path And it is completely, whether they're intellectual, whether they maybe are, they believe in science and
Yeah.
or they're just normal.
Yeah.
They're
Right.
normal and or funny, or just genuine people. They're not like the caricatured pink lady on the gold throne that you see on
Right.
television. There's something so other or so different than what they expected, that can sometimes cause someone to step back and go, why, that doesn't match with my categories. I didn't think that you could be brilliant or smart or believe in science and be a Christian. Let me think about that again. Like, there was a story, Frank Federico, he was on my podcast, and he had wanted nothing to do. He was a high school history teacher, wanted nothing to do with this guy who taught science in his high school. They were thrown together on a field trip chaperoning, and the only seat left, he said, was the one next to him, and he did not want to sit next to this
Oh,
guy.
no. Right.
And it started into an incredible conversation. The first question was, will you teach science? How can you teach science and believe in God at the same time? Well, just diffusing that caricature, the negative stereotypes, and it can, again, be surprising and cause someone to really take a step back and look. So that, that's kind of a disruptive witness, or perhaps Mike Arnold, the first guy that, one who had his house burned down. He was so angry, but he encountered a very loving Christian couple who, he had become in his own words, just an unlovable guy, very difficult to be with. They invited him in for a cup of tea, and he said, treated me like I was human. Well, that's disarming.
Yeah.
That's disarming. So, as an initial, again, we're just talking about an initial catalyst that might cause someone to turn. I guess if I had to add maybe one or two more, probably one of the most surprising things that I found in my study was actually the catalyst that was an unexpected spiritual experience or supernatural occurrence.
Okay.
a dream,
right.
a vision. Actually, people in a point even saying, God, if you're real, and then having some very unexpected answer to that call. Dreams, like I say, visions, just encounters like Mary Poplin. Her stories on my podcast where she wasn't looking for God. She didn't even call out. There was nothing she wanted. She thought she was a good person, didn't need God, and had this incredible encounter with Jesus in a dream. That was so compelling and convincing. She's completely changed her life and her mind. So there are those kinds of things. It's just all kinds of different kinds of catalysts. Some are crisis oriented, like Brandon McConnell, the man who pushed away from God because of that crisis, that God didn't answer his prayer about a dying father. Well, he had another crisis in his life. A young man, healthy, air traffic controller, lost his vision suddenly without explanation. That's a crisis. It causes you to step back and go, what's going on? It made him more open. So it could be sudden, it could be gradual, it could be meeting someone, it could be a variety of things. It could be someone, again, who encounters, I'll give one more. There was a guy, Peter Byram, he's on my podcast as well. He wasn't looking for God. He actually had two interesting roommates. One was an atheist who became a Christian, and one who was a Christian who had become an atheist. So they were all the time going through these discussions like you do in college with ideas. So it was always constantly challenging him. And he had serious doubts about God He said, and insincere motives. Okay, so he
Mm.
wanted to live the way he wanted to live, and he had these doubts, and he really loved Richard Dawkins.
Yep.
And Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists told him to go where the evidence leads. And so he started going where the evidence led, and it led him to debates with William Lane Craig and other things that were really substantive Christian writers. And it was so unexpected and challenging
Hmm.
for him because he found the depth of a worldview that he did not think existed. And I think one of the most telling things for him was that there was a point at which William Lane Craig was trying to get Richard Dawkins to debate him,
Yeah.
and Richard refused. And this
Yep.
happened in London, where Peter's based, and it was very personal for him to witness. So that again, that was a very challenging thing to make him caused him to sit back and think, well, what is it that Richard Dawkins is afraid of? If he's willing to go where the evidence leads,
Right.
why doesn't he go here? So again, a lot of different things will open the door towards a serious quest.
Mm.
So in the process of conversion, there's atheism, resistance, there's a catalyst that opens the door. There's typically a quest of some sort, and then there's, conversion.
Wow. Yeah, I said I was agreeing because I'm friends with Peter. We've never met in person, but we actually did some work together on some video stuff and some audio stuff, and now he's actually working for Justin Briley at the Unbelievable podcast at Premier Christian Radio,
Yes.
Helping them. So
Yes.
what a fantastic story! I think I was introduced to Peter shortly after his conversion because he was trying to help out. He was really zealous and he wanted to be continue to live this Christian life that he had just newly found. So I shake my head saying, yes, I've experienced that with him and, been in communication with him several times. So yeah, Peter's a great story, but I'm one of the things that on the episodes, and I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, but maybe as I describe him, you might remember his name. I remember he was a very intelligent, kind of young man, and you may have been referencing him, but he ended up getting into drinking, ended up, losing his job, and then he was actually living with his mom, and a Christian couple came and was, talking to him about Jesus and, kind of getting him off the drink, if you will, and he ended up kind of entering into a Christian rehab facility, almost like an in-house rehab facility that was, owned and led by a church. But the catalyst event for him was looking at his life and how he treated his mom. So that wasn't what convinced him to be a Christian necessarily. That's what convinced him to get clean and go into rehab. And the only place he knew of was this Christian center that these, two Christians, this husband and wife couple had came and sat and talked to him and just listened to him for a long time. He didn't feel judged at all. And he ends up, a couple of weeks later calling them. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting that, kind of what they probably perceived as a very nominal conversation. I can imagine I'm getting in the car and being like, yeah, we didn't do anything to help that guy at all, was one of the major events that then led him to, ended up finding Jesus and continuing to be a Christian today. So that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is. His name is Rob Oram.
Okay, Rob.
And,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
one of the most interesting things about him, if you look, on his profile picture, it has him he's an Anglican priest.
Okay.
So he's
Yeah.
in his Anglican garb. It's crazy how invested, once these people find life and intellectual wealth and that they never thought existed, they are full in. But I'm glad you brought up that story because I think, again, one of the most compelling parts of my research is at the catalyst stage. Oftentimes atheists will say, I don't believe in Christianity because A, B, C, D, and E, and they're all, rational intellectual reasons. But the door opener for causing someone to reconsider is typically not an intellectual argument. About 25% moved in for intellectual reasons towards a quest.
Wow.
That was their catalyst. But 82% of those in my study were like the couple who came to Rob Oram and there was some kind of meeting, some kind of engagement, some kind of cross their path, some kind of investment, some kind of service or love or embodiment of authentic Christianity, 82%. So 8 out of 10 had some
Wow.
kind of engagement with a Christian who gave them a different picture
Hmm.
or of what Christianity, who Christ is, just by their love or their action or by their intellect or whatever. And so this, if I could say anything, this separation that we have, this us them mentality, this, huge social distancing because of our beliefs. If we could just engage with each
Hmm.
other more,
Yeah.
we see that on the political divide. There's such a hard wall, it seems, between. If we could just listen and engage, and I love the way Michael Ramsden said it. We're called to be salt, and salt means you have to touch.
Right.
It has to be pretty close to the food in order to make a difference. That's
Right.
part of it. You have to be engaging in. And when I look at these stories, after a while I started writing down the name. It was Dolores, it was Mary, it
Mm.
was, that couple.
Yeah.
It was, they are the ones who somehow, what were used in a way to show or be the catalyst in
Yeah.
someone's life to help them move in a different direction. It may have just been, and this is probably the most innocuous kind of catalyst, and that's what I call disruptive circumstance. Some, like Guillaume Bignon, he's going
Yep.
to be in my podcast, or oh no, not Dan Roger. Yeah, he's someone that it was just someone in his life that he knew his grandparents, and in his case, his grandparents became a Christian, or it could be a girlfriend or, someone in your life who makes this decision and you're going, what is that? I
Yeah.
want to disprove it. I don't
Yeah.
like it. I want to disprove it. What are you doing? And that will set someone in a path. So again,
Guignon Bignon is such a fantastic name. I love it. I love his name. But yeah,
yes,
yes, yeah, he's French. Yeah. As I
French,
was
yes.
thinking about, as you're talking, I'm thinking back through like just several instances in my life. I'm a vegetarian. I haven't eaten meat in over 25 years. And I often get asked, just in casual conversation, like, what was the thing that, made you be a vegetarian? And so I tell the story, and it started with me dating a girl in high school who was a vegetarian. And at that point, I didn't think anything of it. I just ate whatever I ate, and it was not until I was around her where she would, kind of be poking and prodding and like, oh, you're going to eat that? Or that's really gross. And, whatever. And we started to, share more meals and continue to go out to dinner. And so I stopped eating meat just around her because I just didn't want to deal with the, oh, you're going to eat that, whatever. And then it wasn't until I started to do the actual research again. So I had that, that pattern that you're talking about where I had this, this kind of slow foray into like, okay, a little bit less meat. And I just started eating a little bit and thinking about it a bit more. And then I started to do some research into how animals were treated and what the process was, and that was around the point where I was like, yeah, I'm done, I'm out, I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm done eating meat. So again, similar, I think if people are just cataloging the times that they've made significant belief changes in their life, these tend to line up. I think that's really interesting.
Once somebody has a catalyst, it may turn them towards to consider something, but it may or may have, it may or may not have any bearing on it's not going to guarantee that they're
Yeah.
going to definitely move in some direction. Just because you're spurred on to consider something doesn't mean that you're going to embrace it. But in your story, it's something you kind of tried on, and then you really started investigating and researching, and that's incredibly important for these atheist conversions, because kind of going full circle here. Again, these are for the most part extremely intelligent, educated, thoughtful people who, again, were very resistant.
Mm.
So while yet they may find something good or attractive, or they were nice to me, or look, they're pretty smart, I don't know about that, let me look into that, that they're just because it's attractive doesn't make them want to believe it, right? So there's still a questing They're still they, they would not believe in Christianity unless it was true. What it was
Right.
good, it may be good, it may be relevant, it may, check a lot of boxes, but unless it's true, unless they believe that God is ontologically real, and the story of Christianity is true, and
Yeah.
everything that goes along with that, from an intellectual perspective, they would not embrace it.
Mm.
And that's where the hard part is, that quest, that journeying
Yeah.
of, you may reach a point of wanting to believe, but really it passing the test, not only intellectually but also existentially. It has to kind of line up into this worldview that really does meet those um, those tests of
Right.
coherence and correspondence with reality.
Mm.
That it that it's not just something that sounds good. It's not just a story.
Right. Right.
But I think that's why. And I keep talking about how sold out these people are as a demographic. It's the most enthusiastic, let's just say, group of believers that I know. I think because they understand what it is to live a very different life,
Yeah.
and they most of them went through the hard journeying
Mm.
of determining whether or not this really is true and God is real and this is worthy of giving my life, because it's not just an intellectual assent. It is
Yeah.
it is a trust, it's a surrender of your
Mm.
life. Um, but yeah, most of the atheists went on to pursue ministry, higher education,
Mm.
just incredible things. If they remained in their own occupation, they're very active, whether it be apologetics or ministry or evangelism
Yeah.
or again academic study or teaching. Um, so it's an amazing group of people, I must say,
Yeah.
to really study. I've been totally inspired by who they are and their life stories.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, I have one final question for you, and I hope this doesn't open up a whole other can of worms. But in my research, in my conversations, in my own journey, one of the things that I hear often from people that go from Christian to start the deconstruction process, they're questioning, they're really unpacking some of the different pieces of Christianity, seeing if they can hold on to their beliefs. They find that it's often lonely, and they find that a lot of people that they're engaging with that are Christians are dismissive, that they're not able to doubt, that they're just kind of brushed on the side. And deconstructing from Christianity can often be a lonely journey. It's one of the reasons that I started the community that I did. It's one of the reasons that I have this channel. I'm wondering, again, from your research, if there's a similar thing on the other side, as people were kind of maybe questioning their atheism, as they're deconstructing from their atheist viewpoint or from their agnostic viewpoint. Are they getting the same sort of pushback and weird looks? And how could you ever do that? Those people are crazy. Or is it much more kind of free thinking and just, oh, that's totally fine. Like, I didn't really get any pushback as I was, engaging the idea of possibly becoming a Christian. Is there an analog on the other side would be my question to that.
Yeah, there's two things I want to say there. One is for the atheist. Yeah, a lot of them did this journeying, this questing very independently, very
Okay.
much on their own. In fact, half of those who came to faith it was a very isolated, independent journey, for two reasons. One is because of the world in which they lived in. It would be a very odd thing, I think, when you're enmeshed is maybe too strong of a word, but it is your
Yeah.
world. It's the
Yeah.
people it's the people you hang out with, it's the worldview you believe, it's all of those things, and to really go against that, particularly towards a worldview that isn't positively perceived. A lot of them did this on their own, very independent,
Yeah.
and a lot of them really received, once they kind of outed themselves as moving in a religious way or towards belief in God, were treated with disdain, and it was very sad and
Yeah.
a very lonely experience
It's unfortunate.
for many of them, and I think that's probably true in a lot of ways, no matter. In fact, I will say, with religious conversion generally, the leading researcher in the world, Louis Rambo, one of the first remarks that I read in his book on understanding religious conversion is resistance is the normal response, because there's just most people say no to change. Over
Yeah.
80%, because again, it's not just changing your worldview, it's changing your world, and it is a
Right.
lot oftentimes to lose.
Yeah.
But for those in this study, it was worth the loss, for what they gained.
Yeah.
But on the other end, I will say, and for those who are deconverting, I wonder if what they're finding is the same thing that the atheists found when they were trying to have conversations with Christians.
Yeah.
Um, it was less than 20, it was around 20% of engagements that they had with Christians that they thought were informed, that Christians actually understood the fullness of their worldview, that they could talk about
Yeah.
science and faith, that they could talk about things, that they embraced questions instead of just dismissing. I know those who are deconverting, oftentimes, they do have doubts and questions and they just go unanswered,
Yeah.
or shut down, one or the other, and neither one gets them,
Right. Right.
anywhere. And so
Yeah.
it behooves we are just as guilty as anybody at presuming our worldview is true, and that's it, and don't question it. Well, that's awful.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
um, whether it's on atheism or Christianity, we live in a world that people don't think deeply. But then when someone does, where do they go?
Right.
Who do they talk with? Where do they talk about these ideas? And so I'm so glad,
Yeah.
Tim, that you have created this place and this space to talk about ideas in an intellectual and a substantive and in a more fully orbed, holistic way, because
Right.
it really is more than just brainy questions. I mean, these are deep questions of the
Yeah.
soul and of your life and what that means, and of your desires, and how you're socially accepted or not. I mean, there's just so many moving parts,
Right.
and we
Yeah.
need safe places where we can. I wanted to say disrobe, but that's a little too revealing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No,
Just
I know exactly what
intellectually,
you mean.
or be yourself,
Yeah.
so that you're not having to play games or be dismissed,
Right. Right.
and that you can find solid conversation. I love what you're doing.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Well, Jana, thank you so much for your research. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain all of your research and your data and the conversations that you've had. Your podcast is excellent, so I would encourage anybody that's checking this out to go check out the Side B podcast. Just really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it was a joy, really, truly, Tim, to come on and talk about all of this with you. What a pleasure.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Well, for you, the audience, I'm hoping that you gained as much from this conversation as I did. I loved hearing the stories that Jana was telling, the people that were on her podcast. All of the data that she was giving was just fascinating. And if you are on that journey where you are going from, Christian, and you're starting to doubt and starting to question, hopefully we gave you a little bit of a pathway, some things to look out for. And if you're on the other side, if you're already an atheist, maybe we gave you some hope that there may be a path back, and that you can be looking at some of those things. Would always want to invite you to our Dealing with Deconstruction Facebook group, where we have those conversations. They are open, they're honest, they're not just these intellectual arguments, but we're really trying to dive in. We're talking about things that people that are on this journey are interested. When you're going from a Christian and you're sliding towards atheism, or whether you're an atheist and you're maybe looking at Christianity as a viable option, you're in that discovery phase. You are welcome in that group. The link for that is in the description of this video, and we will meet you next time as we continue to deal with deconstruction.